Krampus's Revenge, a dark Christmas tale, short horror story. Eve Danner was tired. She had traveled for hours through the snowy mountains to reach the small village. The wind howled outside, and the sky was dark, even though it was only afternoon. The village felt quiet, almost too quiet. Old houses made of wood leaned together, their windows glowing with faint yellow light. Eve was here to write a story. She was a reporter, always looking for something strange to tell her readers. The village was famous for its Krampusnacht festival. Every December, people dressed as Krampus, the scary demon that punished naughty children. But this year, something felt wrong. The villagers were nervous. They whispered about strange things happening, animals disappearing, shadows moving in the night, and bells ringing when no one was there. They told Eve not to dig too deep. Some things are better left alone, an old man said, his eyes wide with fear. Eve didn't believe in stories like this. She thought they were just tales to scare children. But when she heard about an old, abandoned chapel on the edge of the village, she decided to visit. The chapel was cold and broken. Snow had crept inside through holes in the roof. Eve walked carefully, her boots crunching on the icy floor. At the front of the room, near the altar, she saw it, a large old trunk. It was covered in dust and had strange carvings of a horned creature with sharp teeth. Eve touched the trunk. The carvings felt rough and cold under her fingers. A strange feeling crept over her, like someone was watching her. She looked around, but no one was there. A villager who had followed her to the chapel shouted from the door, "Leave it alone. That box is cursed. It holds Krampus himself." Eve laughed nervously. "It's just an old chest," she said, but inside she felt uneasy. Still, her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She had to know what was inside. Eve couldn't stop thinking about the trunk. It stayed in her mind even after she left the chapel. That night, she sat in her small room at the village inn, listening to the wind outside. She tried to write notes for her story, but the words wouldn't come. All she could see in her head were the strange carvings on the trunk. The villager's warning echoed in her ears. "That box is cursed. It holds Krampus himself." Eve shook her head. "It's just a story," she told herself. She didn't believe in curses or demons, but a part of her felt drawn to the trunk, like it was calling her. The next morning, Eve decided to go back to the chapel. She told herself it was for her article. "I need pictures and details," she said. Trying to feel brave, she packed her camera and a flashlight, then set out through the snow. The chapel felt even colder than before. Shadows stretched across the walls as her flashlight flickered. The trunk sat in the same place, covered in dust. Eve stood in front of it, her heart beating fast. "What if it's empty?" she whispered. "What if it's just an old box?" But deep down, she felt like it wasn't empty. Eve knelt beside the trunk and ran her fingers over the carvings again. The horned figure looked alive, with sharp teeth and long claws. She noticed something she hadn't seen before, a rusted lock. Beside it was a small silver key, half buried in the dust. Eve hesitated. Her hand shook as she picked up the key. The moment she touched it, a cold breeze swept through the chapel. Even though all the windows were closed, she froze, looking around. Nothing moved. "Don't be silly," she said out loud. "It's just the wind." Slowly, she put the key in the lock and turned it. The lock clicked, and the trunk creaked open. Inside was a single object, a small black bell. The bell looked old, with strange symbols carved into the metal. Eve picked it up, and it felt heavier than it looked. When she shook it gently, the sound was deep and echoing, like a voice calling from far away. Suddenly, she felt dizzy. The air around her seemed thicker, and the shadows on the walls moved. She dropped the bell and stumbled back. "Stop it," she told herself, her voice trembling. "It's just my imagination." But when she looked at the bell again, it seemed to glow faintly, like it was alive. Eve didn't notice the faint hoofprints appearing in the snow outside the chapel. Eve left the chapel quickly. the bell tucked in her bag. She told herself she would study it later. The air outside felt heavy, and the snow was falling faster. By the time she reached the village, it was almost dark. Back in her room, Eve set the bell on the table. It didn't glow anymore, but it still looked strange, like it didn't belong in this world. She tried to focus on her notes, but the bell seemed to watch her. She pushed it to the side and went to bed, feeling uneasy. That night, Eve had terrible dreams. She saw a dark figure with horns, dragging heavy chains behind him. His eyes burned red, and his long claws scratched at the walls of her mind. He whispered her name over and over, his voice deep and cold. When she woke up, her heart was racing. The room was freezing, and frost covered the window. She heard a faint sound outside, the jingling of bells. It wasn't cheerful, like Christmas bells. It was slow and heavy, each ring making her chest feel tight. Eve looked outside. The snow was thick, but she saw something strange, hoofprints in the snow, leading away from the village. She shivered and closed the curtain. Later that day, the village was in chaos. A farmer burst into the inn, shouting that his animals were gone. Others whispered about strange scratches on their doors. An old woman said she saw a shadowy figure watching her from the trees. Eve listened, her stomach twisting. She thought about the bell. Could it be connected to these events? No, she told herself, it's just a coincidence. But things got worse. That evening, a child went missing. His parents cried, searching everywhere, but all they found were tiny hoofprints leading into the woods. The villagers were terrified. They gathered in the square. Eve stayed in her room, staring at the bell. She felt guilty. What if the stories were true? What if she had released something terrible, lighting torches and locking their doors? As the night grew darker, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the inn. Chains rattled, and the bells jingled again. Eve froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound stopped right outside her door. Suddenly, there was a loud knock. The knock came again, louder this time. Eve's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't move, she held her breath, listening. The air felt cold, like ice pressing against her skin. Then she heard the voice. Eve, it was deep and raspy, almost like a growl. Her hands shook as she reached for the bell on the table. She didn't know why, but she felt safer holding it. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the voice stopped. The air grew silent. She waited, too scared to open the door. Finally, she heard footsteps fading away, slow and heavy. The sound of chains dragged behind them. The next morning, the village was worse. 3 more children were gone. People whispered in fear, locking their windows and doors. The missing children's parents sat in the square, crying. Their voices were hoarse from calling names into the empty woods. Eve walked through the village, feeling the weight of their fear. She knew the villagers didn't trust her. They noticed she was there when the trouble started. Some of them glared at her as she passed. At the edge of the village, she found Lucas, the local folklorist. Lucas was an older man with sharp eyes and a thick coat. He was gathering wood, muttering to himself. "Lucas," Eve said softly, "I think I did something bad." Lucas looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She pulled the bell from her bag and showed it to him. His face went pale. He stepped back, almost dropping his wood. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "In the old chapel," she said. "There was a trunk, you fool," Lucas snapped. "You opened the seal." That bell belonged to Krampus. It keeps him trapped. Without it, he is free to punish the wicked. Eve swallowed hard. "But it's just a story, right?" Lucas grabbed her arm, his grip strong. "Look around you. Do you think this is a story? The missing children, the hoofprints, the sounds at night. This is Krampus's doing, and you brought it upon us." Eve's chest tightened. "How do we stop it?" Lucas shook his head. "There's only one way. The person who broke the seal must face Krampus. They must prove that humanity deserves mercy. If they fail, he will punish the whole village." Eve's blood ran cold. "Face him? How? What does that mean?" Lucas pointed toward the woods. You must go where he is strongest. His lair is deep in the forest, where the children are taken, but you cannot go alone. We must prepare, and the village will not help you. They already blame you. As the day went on, the signs of Krampus's power grew worse. A strange frost covered the houses, and even the fires struggled to burn. Villagers reported seeing shadows moving through the trees, and at night, more children went missing. Eve's guilt weighed heavier with each passing hour. She knew she had no choice. If she didn't act, the whole village would be doomed. Eve and Lucas worked late into the night, preparing to face Krampus. Lucas brought old books filled with strange symbols and stories. He read them by candlelight, his hands shaking. We must find the children, Lucas said, but the woods are dangerous now. Krampus grows stronger with every soul he takes. Eve nodded, though her stomach churned with fear. What can we do? There is a way, Lucas said, an old ritual. If we reach his lair, we can trap him again. But it will not be easy. The path will test us, and Krampus will try to stop us. Lucas packed a small bag with herbs, salt, and a silver dagger. He handed Eve a lantern. Stay close to me. If we get separated, we may not survive. The two of them stepped into the woods. The snow was deep, and the trees stretched high above them, their branches like claws in the moonlight. The air was colder here, biting at their skin. As they walked, the silence grew heavy. There were no sounds of animals, only the crunch of snow under their feet. Eve kept the bell in her pocket, its cold weight reminding her of her mistake. After an hour, they heard something, a faint sound of crying. Eve froze. "Do you hear that?" She whispered. Lucas nodded. "It's a trick. He uses the voices of the children to lead us astray. Do not follow it." The crying grew louder, more desperate. Eve clenched her fists. She wanted to help, but Lucas grabbed her arm. "Stay focused," he said firmly. "If we lose our way, we are finished." They pushed forward, the cries fading behind them. But soon the forest changed. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks twisting unnaturally. The snow turned black in places, as if it were burned. Then they saw the shadows. Dark shapes moved between the trees, too fast to be human. Eve's lantern flickered, the light growing dim. "What are they?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Krampus's servants," Lucas said. "They are the lost, souls he has punished. They guard his path." One of the shadows stepped closer, and Eve gasped. It looked like a child, but its eyes were empty. Its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It reached out for her with long, bony fingers. "Stay back," Lucas shouted. Throwing salt at the creature, it hissed and melted into the shadows. Eve's heart raced as more shadows appeared, surrounding them. Lucas drew a circle in the snow with the salt. "Get inside," he yelled. They crouched in the circle as the shadows closed in, their whispers filling the air. Eve clutched the bell. Feeling its cold surface in her palm, she thought about the children, their small faces full of fear. "We can't stay here," she said. "We have to keep going." Lucas nodded. "The lair is close. Be ready for anything." With trembling hands, Lucas scattered the rest of the salt to drive the shadows back. The two of them ran deeper into the forest, the wind howling around them. Finally, they saw it, a cave at the base of a hill, its entrance glowing faintly red. The ground was littered with broken toys and torn pieces of clothing. Eve's breath caught in her throat. "This is it," Lucas said, "the lair of Krampus." Eve and Lucas stood at the mouth of the cave. The red glow from inside flickered like firelight, and the air was thick with heat and the smell of burned wood. "This is where he takes them," Lucas said, his voice low. "The children are inside. If we don't act fast, their souls will be lost forever." Eve felt her hands tremble. She thought about the missing children and their families. She had to be brave. She nodded. "Let's go." They stepped into the cave. The walls were rough, covered in strange symbols and scratches, as if claws had carved into the stone. The floor was slick with ice, making every step slow and careful. As they walked deeper, The red light grew stronger. In the center of the cave, they saw it, a massive, shadowy figure sitting on a throne made of twisted branches and bones, Krampus. He was even more terrifying than Eve had imagined. His horns curled like a ram's, and his eyes glowed red. His long claws drummed against the arm of his throne, and chains hung from his massive frame. Around him, ghostly children sat in silence, their faces pale and blank. Krampus looked at Eve and Lucas. His deep growling voice echoed through the cave. "You dare come here? You, who are full of sin." Eve stepped forward, her legs shaking. "Let the children go," she said, her voice cracking. "They don't deserve this." Krampus laughed, a terrible sound that made the walls tremble. "And what of you, mortal? You, who broke the seal, you unleashed me. These children are my judgment on the wicked," Lucas whispered to Eve. "The ritual. We need to distract him." Eve nodded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the bell. When Krampus saw it, his eyes narrowed. "You think that will save you?" he growled. "That bell is mine." Eve raised the bell high. "You're wrong. This bell is the key to stopping you." Krampus roared and stood, his chains rattling. The children around him screamed and scattered like smoke. He stepped toward Eve, his claws reaching out. Lucas quickly drew a circle on the ground with the silver dagger, muttering an old chant. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly. "It's working," Lucas said. "Keep him distracted." Eve rang the bell, its deep, haunting sound filling the cave. Krampus froze for a moment, his head tilting as if listening. Then he lunged at her. Eve dodged, barely escaping his claws. She rang the bell again and shouted, "Your time is over, Krampus." The cave began to shake, and cracks appeared in the walls. A faint light shone through the cracks, pushing back the red glow. Lucas finished the chant, and the ground beneath Krampus's feet began to split open. Krampus roared, his body twisting in anger. "You cannot defeat me," he screamed. "I will return." Eve looked at Lucas. "Is it enough?" she asked. Lucas nodded. "The ritual is working. The children will be free." Around them, the ghostly figures of the children began to fade, their faces softening into peaceful expressions. The weight on Eve's chest lifted slightly. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The cave trembled as the ritual took hold. Light poured from the cracks in the ground, and Krampus roared in anger, his massive form starting to dissolve like smoke in the wind. Eve clutched the bell tightly, her knuckles white. Lucas's voice was steady but urgent. "Eve, this is your moment. The ritual weakens him, but it needs a final act. You must choose." Eve's heart pounded. "What do you mean? What do I have to do?" Lucas's face was pale, his eyes full of worry. "You must offer yourself. The bell is tied to you now because you broke the seal. Krampus will take your sue. But the children and the village will be saved." Eve felt the blood drain from her face, her soul. She looked at Krampus, who stared back at her with his burning red eyes. His voice, low and menacing, filled the cave. "You think one soul will stop me?" Krampus growled. "You cannot win. I will rise again, and the world will know my wrath." The cave cracked louder, and pieces of stone fell from the ceiling. Lucas grabbed her arm. "Eve, we don't have much time. You have to decide." Eve looked at Lucas, then at the children, their ghostly forms watching her with wide, fearful eyes. Her thoughts raced. She remembered their laughter from when she first arrived in the village, how they played in the snow. She remembered the parents crying, begging for their children to come home. She swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. "If I do this, will it stop him?" Lucas hesitated. "It will seal him away for now, but nothing is permanent. One day, the seal might break again, but it's the only way to save them." Eve stepped forward, her legs shaking. Krampus loomed over her, his dark form flickering like a dying flame. She rang the bell one last time, the sound echoing through the cave. "Take me," she said, her voice trembling, "but leave the children. Leave the village." Krampus laughed, the sound sending chills down her spine. "So brave," he said, his sharp teeth glinting. "Very well. Your sacrifice is accepted. Eve closed her eyes as Krampus reached out with his long claws. Pain shot through her body, and everything went dark. Eve felt the claws pierce her chest, but instead of sharp pain, there was a coldness that spread through her body. It was as if the warmth of her soul was being pulled away, leaving her hollow. She opened her eyes and saw Krampus leaning close, his fiery gaze locked onto hers. His grin stretched wider, filled with dark triumph. Lucas cried out, his voice breaking, "Eve, no!" The bell in Eve's hand glowed brightly, its light growing stronger and stronger. Krampus paused, his expression changing to anger and confusion. The light spread across his shadowy form, making him flicker like smoke caught in a windstorm. Eve's body trembled as the bell's power surged, her heartbeat slowed, and the cave around her blurred. She thought of the children, their faces full of fear but still alive because of her choice. She thought of the village, the snow-covered streets, and the people who would wake up safe. Krampus roared, his voice shaking the walls. "You may take me now, mortal," he growled, "but your sacrifice will not destroy me. I will return, and when I do, your world will suffer." Eve held the bell tighter. Her voice was weak but steady. "You'll never win. There will always be people willing to fight you." The cracks in the ground widened, glowing brighter. The chains around Krampus's body rattled, tightening like they were alive. His massive form began to collapse, his claws scratching at the air as he was pulled downward. Eve's strength was nearly gone, her body cold and heavy. She looked at Lucas, who stood just outside the circle of light. His eyes were full of tears. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice faint, "promise me you'll tell them what happened. Tell them why." Lucas nodded, his hands trembling. "I swear, Eve, I will make sure they remember." Krampus gave one last deafening roar as the ground beneath him split open. He was pulled into the glowing void, his body disappearing into the light. The chains snapped tight, sealing him away. As Krampus vanished, the cave grew silent. The bell in Eve's hand dimmed, its glow fading until it was cold and lifeless. Eve sank to her knees, her body weak and pale. She felt herself slipping away, her vision darkening. She heard Lucas's voice, distant and full of sorrow. "Eve, stay with me, please." But Eve couldn't respond. The last thing she saw was the faint glow of the children's spirits as they faded away, free at last. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips before the darkness took her completely. The cave grew quiet, the glowing cracks in the ground sealed shut, leaving only the faint echo of Krampus's roar. Lucas knelt beside Eve's still body, his hands shaking as he touched her cold cheek. Her face looked peaceful, as if she had found some comfort in her final moments. The bell lay beside her, dull and lifeless. Its strange power was gone, but it still felt heavy with meaning. Lucas picked it up, holding it close to his chest. "Eve," he whispered, tears streaming down his face, "you saved us all." Outside the cave, the forest began to change. The dark, twisted trees straightened, their branches no longer clawing at the sky. The black snow melted, revealing fresh, white powder beneath. The eerie silence was replaced by the soft sounds of the wind and distant birds. Lucas walked back to the village, carrying the bell. He felt hollow, the weight of Eve's sacrifice heavy on his soul. When he reached the square, the villagers were gathered there, staring at the horizon. The missing children were returning, their small forms appearing from the edge of the woods. They looked tired and scared but unharmed. Their parents rushed to them, crying tears of joy and relief. "She did it," Lucas said softly. "Eve saved them." The villagers looked at him, their faces filled with gratitude and guilt. They knew they had doubted Eve, even blamed her. But she had given everything to protect them. Days passed, and the village began to heal. The children slowly returned to their lives, though they sometimes spoke of strange dreams and a shadowy figure with horns. The people rebuilt their homes and lit candles in memory of Eve. But Lucas couldn't rest. He kept the bell hidden, locked away in a safe place. He knew its power was not gone entirely. He remembered Krampus's final words, "I will return." One snowy night, Lucas stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark trees. He thought he heard something faint, distant bells jingling in the wind. He clutched the bell in his hand, his heart heavy with fear and doubt. Eve had sacrificed herself to stop Krampus, but had it truly been enough? Was the evil really gone? Or was it simply waiting for another chance to rise? The snow fell softly around him, covering the world in silence. Lucas turned back to the village, whispering a quiet prayer. The end of Krampus was a victory, but it was not the end of the story.